Hey folks, unfortunately we do not have a regular episode for you today because Phoenix is super under the weather. Not to worry, it's nothing serious, but our sweet Bible dad is well and truly out of commission. So I thought it would be nice to do a little demo of what you can expect here in the show feed after the Boo Club is officially over. Every now and then, I get a little bit of mental grit stuck in my brain about a book or a podcast or a movie, and when you have a podcast, you're allowed to foist that grit upon an unsuspecting audience, which is you. So, without any further ado, this is Lessons from Revival. So I spend a lot of my time thinking about what makes excellent horror. Writing, as well you know, is a craft, and like any craft, it can be learned. So that's what I'm going to try to do for this occasional series, is learn from the best. And to me, Revival is truly some of King's best work. Now, we talked at length in our Revival episode about the structure of Revival, how it dovetails between the styles of contemporary literature and weird tales, cosmic horror. What I'd like to touch on today, though, is how to build literary themes in tandem with building tension. Contemporary horror, at least as it is here in 2021, tends to be self-conscious of the literary meaning of its monsters. The earliest movie I remember seeing that felt super intentional about linking metaphor and plot was The Babadook, written and directed by Jennifer Kent. The Babadook is about grief. It tells you it's about grief. Its ending is only satisfying if you're actively aware that it's about, specifically, grief. Like The Babadook, Revival is very, very open about what it's about. Religion, faith healing, miracles, these things might as well be smoke and mirrors, so says Reverend Jacobs over and over again. The performance of miracles is just that, a performance. It's a plastic Jesus on a set of tracks. It's a carnival sideshow. It's a faith healer, gladly accepting donations and reverie while leaving broken promises and broken people in his wake. All that seems meaningful and good and godly in the world is as random and meaningless as lightning. So that's great. Very fun. Dust in the wind. I love it. These are potentially cynical conclusions you can draw from Revival depending on if you agree with the good Reverend and his terrible sermon. Personally, I'm kind of into it. But I would like to bring us back to the craft of writing horror, because there are two main things I want to consider here along these themes. One, how does King establish the themes? And two, how do the themes impact the horror? So let's hit those two in order. Part 1, how King does it. Revival is a book about the real potential for a godless, random universe full of hurt and horror and empty prayers. That's a pretty big goddamn topic for a book to be about. So how does he get there? Well, for one, he puts his characters repeatedly into situations which test their faith. The young die and the old live on. Good people get sick, bad people get rich. Grief and addiction are the background radiation of Revival. This is the question of evil writ large. If you want to write a story about people losing their faith, you have to honestly confront the things which test real people's faith all the time. In Revival, sinners flourish and the godly are desperate enough to attend Revival faith-healing churches. When good things happen in Revival, they're usually materialistic good things. That is, they're caused by material means. Unlike, say, Green Mile, no one is being healed by the curative love and light of a god or a ka or anything like that in Revival. The miracles on display are kind of cynical miracles, directly traceable to flawed technologies, for example. The only truly lighthearted and uplifting moments in Revival come not from on high, but from the meaningful bonds characters create with each other. As a side note, I think that it's important that Revival isn't a one-trick pony. This isn't a Requiem for a Dream kind of situation. The bad things that happen feel more forceful because good things are also happening in the book. If you want an example of a horror movie that gets actively kind of silly because there's just only bad luck, check out the 2018 movie A Quiet Place, preferably with headphones and in the dark. It's a good, scary movie, but it gets a little goofy that only bad things happen. Anyway, that's one way King establishes heavy themes, by having heavy plot elements and situations. Another is by having his characters actively discuss the themes. A reverend is a great character to have around if you want to just spell some shit out. Ditto with politicians, radio personalities, really anyone who's apt to monologue. Serial killers, too, have a penchant for just kind of up and saying, hey, here's the theme of this book, as anyone who has read Mr. Mercedes can attest. I also noticed in Revival that earlier is better for this kind of strategy. We get our first musings on God and goodness and false hope within the first couple of chapters, which gives us a pattern to search for. We're looking for those themes. Now that may seem obvious, but it's actually really important, I think particularly in horror. Crimson Peak, directed by Guillermo del Toro, is a great example of a horror piece that has really muddy themes. Don't get me wrong, it's a beautiful movie, but by the end, you just kind of feel like, why did I sit through that? It ends up making it less scary, which brings us to part 2. How does this impact horror? Literary themes are very fun, and I think they're usually worth having around in their own right. But in horror, they play to a downright mechanical aspect of the genre. Namely, horror is dependent on playing by a certain set of rules, either explicitly stated or otherwise implied. Take, for example, Nightmare on Elm Street. You can die in this movie very easily, but only while asleep. This establishes an instant basis for tension. You know the boundaries for danger are what they are. Awake is safe, but no one can be awake forever. That kind of literal rule set is all over the place in horror. See also the Saw series, It Follows, The Thing from Outer Space, Invasion of the Body Snatchers. All of these are great examples. And in King's own canon, we get explicit rule sets for It, The Dark Half, Salem's Lot, Pet Sematary. There's truly too many to just list out. And it's because it's really good to know where you stand. Horror depends on the pervasive sense that you could survive, if only you could stay awake. This is where our literary themes come back into the conversation. In Revival, the rules of the game are what's at issue. Because what is the American conception of Christianity if not a horror-style set of rules? Be good, you win eternal life. Be godless or sinful, and God will cut you down. Jacobs explicitly calls to attention these aspects of Christianity in the terrible sermon, referring to them as the carrot and the stick, but they can be thought just as easily as a kind of horror rule set. This is King using a cultural set of rules to build one kind of horror tension in Revival. And religious horror often plays into this dynamic. See especially The Exorcist, or if you want a deep, fucked up rabbit hole to jump down, look into Midwestern hell houses in America. Trust me on it. In Revival, Jacobs is putting himself and others in danger of a literal, biblical, godly punishment. But, of course, there's this other thematic tension in religious horror, which is, well, what if you're wrong? What if at the end of life there is simply nothing? Or there's another religion's conception of the afterlife, or some other fresh hell that you can't even put a name to? What if we're playing the wrong game entirely? Again, here it's important to view these questions not philosophically, but mechanically. Philosophically, living a good and moral life is its own reward. I myself am no longer a man of faith, but I'm still doing my best to be capital G good. In the context of a horror piece, we're instructed to think about the rules. In Revival, a lot is riding on the question of whether or not we know the rules at all. It makes the ending that much more climactic and terrifying that we get a very bad answer to that question. Is there life after death? Absolutely. It's an unending toil under elder gods inconceivable to the mind. Now that's fun and all, but to hear me say it devoid of context, the concept itself isn't necessarily that scary, right? You can conceive of it. I would like to argue that it's actually with the buildup of literary themes to back that concept up that the ending of Revival takes on that kind of gut-wrenching, existential dread quality that religious horror can, at its best, evoke. If you give someone the SparkNotes version of a story, you're going to lose out on building those themes up. It's like trying to make a soup without letting it simmer. The themes reinforce the terror. For another example of a book that plays with questions of divinity, good and bad actions, uncertainty about moral rules, I would highly recommend Paul Tremblay's Cabin at the End of the World. Just be prepared to be disturbed on multiple levels. That book is strong sauce, but it's one of my all-time favorites. So, there's our lesson from Stephen King's Revival. Literary themes, when constructed properly, can justify and reinforce horror's ability to scare and disturb. I hope you've enjoyed this little experiment, and consider keeping the Boo Club in your feed after we officially end for more rants on Stephen King, the craft of horror, those kinds of things. We'll see you next week for The Outsider, and then after that will be The Institute. Stay spooky, stay healthy. We'll see you next time.